The Australian Financial Review.
Sanjeev Gupta's global steelmaking empire is in trouble. It's been 3 years since the collapse of its main financier Greensill Capital, and Gupta's business GFG is still struggling to refinance billions of dollars in debt. Several of its plants across Europe are in shutdown mode, and others are fending off insolvency.
The future of the Whyalla steelworks is under a cloud tonight, with GFG Alliance axing almost 50 jobs to save money.
Closer to home, questions hang over the future of its steelworks in the South Australian town of Whyalla, which is running at a loss and shedding jobs.
There's no doubt British billionaire Sanjeev Gupta, who saved the company from going under 7 years ago, is under pressure. It's been a rough year with shifts cut back.
But Gupta is still living the high life. In September, despite the problems at his steelworks, he bought a $10 million Sydney waterfront apartment from celebrity broadcaster John Laws.
And in a development that's full of similarly prominent Sydney identities, so he's still living like a magnate, as one part of his company doesn't pay its dry cleaning bills.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, senior reporter Simon Evans and Rear Window editor Myriam Robin on Sanjeev Gupta's flashy property purchase, the fate of his business empire, and the South Australian town bearing the brunt of his financial problems. It's Thursday, November 7. Hi, Simon. Hi, Myriam. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Simon, last month you went on a road trip to Whyalla to talk to some of the people dealing with Sanjeev Gupta's steelworks. Tell us about Whyalla and what prompted you to go on the trip and who you met there.
Sure. So Whyalla is a town on the Eyre Peninsula. It's about 380 k's northwest of Adelaide. Whyalla is a real boom and bust industrial town. In the early 1960s, BHP built the steelworks, which is where all of the focus is 60 years later. There'd long been speculation about the town's demise. So in 2012, Tony Abbott claimed that the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard's carbon tax would be the town's death knell.
Whyalla risks becoming a ghost town, an economic wasteland, if this carbon tax goes ahead.
The Labor government's Trade Minister, Craig Emerson, had a very bizarre and quite unforgettable take on Tony Abbott's comments.
No Whyalla wipeout there on my TV, no Whyalla wipeout.
He sung a song called No Whyalla Wipeout
There on my TV, shocking me right out of my brain.
to the tune of the Skyhooks classic in the 1970s, horror movie. So Arium, which was a company that was spun off by BHP, unfortunately it went broke in 2016, and this devastated the local community. So Sanjeev Gupta had rode into town in 2017 as a real saviour after Arium collapsed.
As the new owner of this business, I see this as a great opportunity for Whyalla, but also for Australia, to show how Australia should and will be a world-class steel producer.
And promising that he could pretty much single-handedly revive the economy with a focus on being a green steel maker. Green steel uses renewable energy and scrap steel as a feedstock.
There were pipers and praise in Whyalla today as residents marched through the town to celebrate the saving of its steelworks.
So when he got the keys in August 2017, there was great fanfare, great relief in the Whyalla community.
Very excited, very relieved, I suppose you could say.
Buzzing pretty well today, so high hopes.
So I and a photographer, Ben Searcy, thought it was time for us to go and see what is exactly happening on the ground, get a real sense of their attitude, towards Sanjeev Gupta and the steelworks operations and where it was at. So I spoke to a heap of suppliers to the steelworks, the publican of the Westlands Hotel Motel, Darren Beer.
That's an appropriate name.
It certainly is. Probably one of the most interesting people that I spoke to was an industrial dry cleaner called Chris Press.
So we've got Darren Beer, the publican, and Chris Press, the dry cleaner.
Yes, quite extraordinary names, but both wonderful people to talk to and very worried about what is happening in Whyalla.
My name's Chris Press. We run a dry cleaning and commercial laundry there in Whyalla.
Yeah, so Chris, he'd been running the business for about 17 years.
I've been in Whyalla since 1987. It's always fluctuated, always up and down.
He has sleeves of tattoos. He's a former local footy player, a real character. And in the good times, he was always getting paid on time. But in the few weeks leading up to our visit, he wasn't getting paid.
You know, I hate having to do it, but at times I have to hold him the ransom. I have to hold on to the gear. We have it all ready to go, all cleaned, ready to go, and I'll sit on it until I'm paid. I've been through this too many times.
But across the board, pretty much everyone we spoke to in Whyalla was fairly pessimistic.
Yeah, well, what Whyalla needs is some clarity for a start. You know, we need some definite timelines on when things are going to happen, or if they're going to happen. And if they're not going to happen, just tell us the truth.
They've just been let down again and again.
Gupta and his team need to really get their act together, or two, someone else takes it over. Everybody in the town relies on the steelworks. It's whether it's freight companies, people like myself, football clubs are really struggling. We're struggling at every level, and it's really difficult.
So before we talk about why Gupta's Whyalla Steelworks is in such financial trouble and Gupta's global empire is struggling more broadly, how did we get here? How did Gupta become a steel baron in the middle of South Australia?
He has a fascinating past, Sanjeev Gupta. He comes from old money. His father, Pardaman, in India, started off with a bicycle factory and built this industrial empire that ultimately employed more than 30,000 people. And the young Sanjeev Gupta, attended Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, and he was studying economics, but he was a real trader right from the start. And there's a famous story that when he was one of the residential colleges there, Trinity College, he actually started his own business trading metals, selling to customers in Africa. And he was using the university's telex machine to operate that business because under university status, they had special elements where universities did not have to pay value-added tax, which is the British version of our GST. Over time, he bought some ageing industrial plants, some steel plants, some aluminium factories in Europe and later in the United States. So he had a large business when he first started looking around for expansion opportunities in Australia. And he came to Australia to look over these ailing assets that had gone into administration. So when he bought the business, the collapsed Arium, so there was the Whyalla Steelworks, but there was also another very large business, which is probably less well known in Australia. It's called Infrabuild. Mm-hmm. So it operates a couple of smaller steel mills, one in Rooty Hill in Western Sydney, one in Laverton on the outskirts of Melbourne. It also has a large recycling operation, and it distributes steel to customers all over Australia and into Asia. And that business employs about 4,800 people. So it is actually a larger business than the Whyalla Steelworks. So that Infrabuild and the Whyalla Steelworks were very much a part of Gupta's green steel dream, we could call it.
So, Myriam, Sanjeev Gupta arrived in Australia And he immediately made himself known on the social scene. He's a businessman who's been associated with networking, with expensive houses, boats and private jets. How was he received?
So I think he comes in and he's immediately living like the magnate that he is. He puts in place, I think, a template that he'd very much honed in all the other jurisdictions, particularly the UK where he'd operated previously. So he rents a trophy home from businessman Ian Joy, Bellevue Hill, called Barford, which is quite a famous house. He starts getting taken around and introduced to all of the famous and important people. And then to celebrate 2 years of GFG's operation in Australia, GFG being his global company, he held this big party and everyone who's anyone seems to get invited. And so we find out about it pretty quickly. And then he ends up hosting people like Mike Cannon-Brookes or Rex Patrick, who at that moment was a sort of independent politician, quite powerful, Neville Crutchton, Skye Leckie, who's a very important society and charity figure in Sydney. And he basically has everyone over to a 3-course meal. It's very impressive, 200 guests. And then he gives a speech, and it's quite a heartfelt speech. He talks about Bell Potter's Les Owen, who's a famous stockbroker who's been taking him around and introducing him to people. He introduces everyone to the man who's going to be running the InfraBuild organisation, which is announced a couple of days later. And it's really a moment of his having arrived. And I think, it's easy to look at that and just think, he's just a party animal or society figure. But I think this is actually very important for his business because he operates always with the acquiescence and often the support of governments who want all of these green steel jobs. And, you've got to impress them, you've got to dine them, you've got to show them that you're someone to be taken seriously. So this impressive sort of social figure and his business operations actually dovetail very much.
And it's not just the movers and shakers that were at his party. He also set up an advisory board that had some big names on it.
Yeah, he did. People like Alexander Downer, the former foreign minister, Ray Horsburgh, who was actually at the party as well, and Ross Garnaut, who is the famous economist. The way I think of these advisory boards is that they're not actually running the business in any way, but they're almost there just to lend credibility and to make introductions, and I think that's what he relies on.
One of the important strategies that Gupta seems to employ is that the decarbonisation effort that the world is sort of trying to undertake does require enormous amounts of capital. And one of the ways that he does operate with governments around the world is in looking for tax breaks, incentives and ways for the government and the public sector and taxpayers to also be helping to fund this green steel dream. So the first couple of years, the town of Whyalla fully embraced him. He was something of a local hero, but it was in 2021 that things really started to unravel for him.
Myriam, we're talking about Sanjeev Gupta and the fate of his business empire. When were the first serious questions raised about GFG? Did its problems begin with the collapse of Greensill Capital, which was one of its main financiers in 2021, or did they start before then?
I think there'd been some sort of smoke signals that, relating to the opacity of the business and how it was quite hard to actually gauge its performance. And then Greensill collapsed, basically.
Once dubbed the saviour of steel, now fighting to save his steel empire. It's crunch time for Sanjeev Gupta and his proud but beleaguered Liberty Steel.
And basically became very clear that this was a business that was entangled with Greensill, and that caused a lot of problems.
His business owns Greensill's $6.5 billion, which it doesn't have. And Greensill's major funder, Credit Suisse, essentially pulled the pin, leaving Greensill to file for bankruptcy.
It might be worth just explaining Greensill. So it's started by Lex Greensill, who's an Australian entrepreneur, and it does supply chain financing, but on steroids, basically. So it would allow small businesses to be paid early by big businesses by basically buying the invoice with a discount. So they wouldn't get everything that they were paid, but say 95% of it. And then Greensill would chase the big business for the whole amount. So that small difference was its profit margin. But the thing that it did was then it would securitize these invoices and on-settle them into other financiers, into these big structured things. And the whole thing was backed up by insurance. And kind of like what happened in the GFC, eventually the insurance came apart and the whole thing just very quickly froze and unraveled. And in the aftermath of that, it became clear that billions of Gupta's businesses were basically tied through Greensill, as much as $5 billion, and that a lot of the Greensill businesses weren't even securitizing or getting involved over sales they've made, but getting paid early for future sales and things like that. So basically Gupta was left scrambling to refinance, and Credit Suisse was also owed money by Greensill. That sort of was money that it had lent Gupta's businesses early. So the whole thing just was a real cash crunch on that business. And it's important to remember as all this came apart, just how close Lex Greensill and Sanjeev Gupta was. They would speak several times a day, it emerged. Their families were close and they saw each other very regularly. So the businesses were intertwined in a way. And they have to be unintertwined now, and that's a real business challenge. Meanwhile, the UK Serious Fraud Office also launched an investigation in 2021 into the Gupta businesses, and it was this very, very intense period, and he went to ground for a long time while he dealt with it. In 2023, he sort of emerged a little bit. He made a visit to Australia. James Gorman, who's the Australian-born CEO of Morgan Stanley, gave a speech at the State Library. And at the last minute, Sanjeev Gupta came along. The organisers didn't really expect him. And yeah, he sort of was photographed with all of Melbourne's movers and shakers. It was kind of the old Sanjeev is back. I actually spoke to an investment banker, quite a senior investment banker, who heard about it very soon after, because a more junior banker had been seated next to Gupta on the table and sort of heard all about his plans and his businesses, and then goes into the office very soon after and says, this guy's amazing, he's got all these great plans, this is a real opportunity for us here. I guess he hadn't seen all the headlines, but the more senior banker that I spoke to was just like, I put a stop to that. So clearly he still had it. He still had the ability to convince. He was still full of ideas and enthusiasm. But I think the Australian business community was pulling back, and that investigation in the UK is probably why.
Absolutely, Myriam. The scepticism levels went through the roof at that point. And in May this year, he came out and said, we've got a problem. We're going to have to delay the electric arc furnace for at least 2 years. That really was a sort of a concrete development where people who had previously held out a glimmer of optimism were then going, actually, I think this is really starting to unravel.
So it was in May when that promised $500 million upgrade to Whyalla Steelworks was delayed that concern levels really jumped. How much financial stress is GFG under, and how is that affecting its Australian assets?
GFG is under a lot of stress right around the world. So their steel plants in Romania and the Czech Republic that are offline and owe money. Britain's corporate registrar is pursuing about 70 different companies, private companies in the GFG empire, that have actually failed to produce corporate accounts as they are supposed to over the last 3 years. In Australia, there's been a series of extra problems that he has had to face. So the biggest one is that the Whyalla Steelworks blast furnace has been offline and actually not able to make steel for several months this year. Right now, the steelworks is again unable to make steel. There was some impurities found in the blast furnace and it's been offline for another 6 or 7 weeks. And there's no sense in the short term that it's coming back. So while that steelworks is offline and not making steel, that makes extra financial pressure on the business.
Mm-hmm.
There's also problems at InfraBuild. It was, for many people, the jewel in the crown in Gupta's global empire. It was making very, very good money, but there's been a series of bigger picture issues that have hurt it badly. One of the main ones is there has been a major glut of steel coming out of China. So this is not just affecting InfraBuild, this is affecting all steel makers in the region. Huge volumes of steel oversupplied out of China as the Chinese economy starts to falter. And what's happened is InfraBuild has actually fallen to a loss in the financial year 2023-24. It made a loss of 18.6 million. To show just how far that's fallen, the previous year it made a profit of 240 million.
Mm-hmm.
And overlaid across all of these setbacks, the UK Serious Fraud Office is still investigating the companies.
But Myriam, none of this has stopped Gupta from buying a new waterfront apartment in Sydney.
No. So a couple of weeks ago, he settled on a $10 million waterfront apartment in Woolloomooloo's Finger Wharf development, which is very iconic. Google it, or anyone who's in Sydney probably knows what it looks like. He bought the apartment of John Laws, the radio legend, and in a development that's full of similarly prominent Sydney identities. I also got told he bought an associated boat berth. So he's still living like a magnate as one part of his company doesn't pay its dry cleaning bills. He actually bought the Woolloomooloo apartment through a corporate entity that already owns the $30 million Potts Point mansion that he bought a few years earlier. And it's part of a growing property portfolio that Gupta has. So he has a $80 million home in London's Belgrave Square and a 4-bedroom villa in Dubai, where he spent a lot of the time immediately after Greensill collapsed. So I think the thing with this lifestyle, I guess it suggests someone who potentially is distracted or someone who is not giving Whyalla and the problems there their full attention. Obviously, for people who are literally owed money, it's quite hard to stomach. And I think it just undermines his standing with politicians. If in the beginning this sort of lifestyle was a way to signal his credibility as someone who it's worth doing business with and trusting to take over the steelworks, I think at this point it's actually undermining him, because politicians then have to answer, hang on, he's got all these debts, how come he is buying a $10 million house?
Yeah. So, Simon, what does this mean, and what do GFG's financial troubles mean for Whyalla, but also for the state and federal governments in Australia hoping for a green steel success story?
So on the ground, there are many people, suppliers, local townsfolk who, while they don't want the steelworks to go into administration again, their firm view is that perhaps it will be better off if there is a different owner who is more financially stable, who can follow through with some of the heavy investment that is required to get this ageing steelworks into the modern era. But if Gupta does fail at Whyalla, then it's also a problem for the federal government. So Australia has only 2 large steel makers. The biggest is the $9 billion ASX-listed BlueScope. It runs the Port Kembla steel mill just south of Sydney in the Wollongong region. And it too has had a profit downgrade. It's being hit by the same broader forces of a Chinese steel glut. But Whyalla is the only other major steelmaker. So Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, one of his big planks is around the Made in Australia program, where the federal government wants to have more manufacturing, more things made in Australia, and steel is at the heart of all of that. The Federal Industry Minister, Ed Husic, is also a big believer in the importance of homegrown steelmaking. So the Whyalla plant, as we said, built in the 1960s, it's an ageing plant, but it is in some ways a real symbol of the problems and the challenges that industrial economies have in making steelmaking a little more greener and environmentally friendly. And the experts say that steelmaking around the world makes up around 9% of total carbon emissions.
So a final question for both of you then. Can Sanjeev Gupta survive these latest financial troubles, or do you think it's all catching up?
Right now, I think he is facing the biggest battle that we've seen since he came on the scene in early 2017 and started examining whether he would indeed be a buyer of the collapsed Arium business. The Greensill collapse in 2021, as Myriam has explained, was a huge hammer blow. Somehow he's managed to extricate himself from out of that, and there's been plenty of developments along the way, but he's still surviving, and GFG is still afloat. There's larger market forces at play as well. The Chinese steel glut can't be underestimated. It is hitting all players in the industry, but those who are already under financial pressure, such as GFG, are really finding it tough. Who knows? The scepticism is at its highest point that I can remember. So how this all plays out really remains to be seen.
I think with people like this who take a small fortune and make it into a very big fortune, essentially what they're doing is playing with risk. They're taking educated risks and piling them on one after the other, and if all of them pull off, you end up being one of the world's most successful industrialists. But Gupta has come through several risks surviving, and, some of them actually went very well for him. But I think, ultimately at some point you want to de-risk your business, and I think it still seems to me like it's very, very risky, and I would say the odds are against him.
Thanks, Myriam. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you, and thanks for having us, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Simon Evans and Myriam Robin reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.